Okay, hello everyone. Fiona Littlewood here from Inspire. Welcome to the online book club. Today I've got Claire. We've got quite a lot of Claires today. We've got Claire from Inspire. We've got Katie, Claire Batten, Jess, Terri, and Claire Harvey. So thank you for joining us. And what we've been reading this month is The Familiars by Stacey Halls. And this was a debut novel from 2019. I think I'd actually read it before, so I've had a quick skip through again this time, and I did enjoy it. But I know that she's also written a couple more since, which we might speak about later. It takes place against the backdrop of the Pendle witch trials in Lancashire. It features a young woman who's only 17, but already married to a much older man. And she's on her fourth pregnancy and she hasn't managed to carry a baby to full term. And she meets another young woman in the woods called Alice Gray, who is actually a real character from the Pendle witch trials. And they strike up a relationship. And Alice becomes Fleetwood's midwife. And as you're probably aware, in those days, there was quite an overlap between being a midwife and or a wise woman, and that could brand you as being a witch in some cases. So it's about female friendship, it's about class differences, and it's about witchcraft. So could I start with you, Terri, and ask you for your first impressions of it?
It was very full. I found the author's style rather bleak and journalistic. And I do believe that in a previous life, she was a journalist. However, it kept my attention. I think there is so much in there, particularly the development of almost the metamorphosis of Alice and Fleetwood. And there's the sense of betrayal, huge sense of loss, particularly for Fleetwood. So even though the prose can be quite predictable and bleak, there were pockets of very, very rich experiences, particularly when she writes of Fleetwood's pain at her several miscarriages. So, you know, for me, that drew me in even more.
Oh, I actually listened to it. I don't know if any of the others of you listened to it. And I really enjoyed the narrator. She sounded like a very young woman. And I found her very believable. And a strong character who developed throughout the course of the novel. And what about you, Katie? What did you like it, or what did you think about it?
Yeah, I really enjoyed all of it. I personally really love the journey that reading takes me on in terms of mindfulness. And when I was reading this story, nothing else was going on around me, just this story. I actually really enjoyed the style that it was written in, and I think it benefited from that. I enjoyed like the description and like the atmospheric language that was really used to really transport you back to being, you know, in, you know, the around the time of the witch trials. I really loved like the stories about potentially like that, not just friendship, but also kind of what it says about like the roots of feminism, essentially, and women supporting like other women, which is something I think we even struggle with in society today. I thought that whilst it was really interesting to understand her pain of not being able to have a child, how much of it shone through to me that she herself is still a child, and the weight of the expectation on her, knowing that, you know, she might die, you know, just then that is her only worth as a child herself, to like have another child was really telling. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, good. I liked the relationship between Fleetwood and Alice, and they did depend on each other very strongly for different reasons. And I wondered what you felt about that relationship, what the similarities between them were and what were the differences, and whether they could truly ever have been real friends. What do you think, Claire B? Is it all right to call you Claire B? Button?
Oh, right, okay. Well, I enjoyed the style. I thought the style was good. I didn't think it was particularly journalistic. I don't think they could really be true friends, because you have this class, business coming out, because I don't think that Fleetwood would have ever been arrested as a witch, even though she had the dog, which was alluded to as a familiar, if you like. I felt about the treatment of women was very, very interesting, because although Fleetwood was in a different sort of strata of society, she still wasn't treated very nice, was she?
No.
I mean, she was expected to just have babies, and started having babies at a very young age. And I also found it was quite interesting the comments her mother made about Fleetwood's father and how he treated her, how he always had another woman available. And her husband was the same. If she died in childbirth, it didn't really matter to him, because he could go and pick another one up. And from that point of view, I think it was good, because it shows people what went on at that time. I don't know how historically accurate it was in some ways. I'm never too sure, because I've read several books at the moment like this, where you pick something to do with people that have actually existed in history, and then the author tries and invents a story around them. And they couldn't do it now, because they'd get sued, because it would be wrong. But because because these people existed such a long time ago, you actually are allowed to do it. There's some sort of license that authors seem to have, because there's quite a lot of books like this going around at the moment, where you have historical characters and then you invent a story around them.
I'm not sure either how historically accurate it was. I did like the fact that it mentioned real people. I mean, we don't know that the stories are close to what actually happened to them, but I found it interesting. I did Google the Pendle witch trials, and I'd heard of them, but I wanted to find out a bit more. And it was quite a surprise to discover that the names were actually the same. So I found that added another layer of realism for me. And I got a very strong sense of what the houses were like and the countryside, and there was the reference to the Turkey carpets.
Did you ever find out when you did your research why Alice Gray was let off? Because
no, I must admit I didn't go into it that deeply, but I was aware that she was the one that was.
She was the only one, wasn't she? And she's the one in this book, and there didn't seem to be any reason why she would. Now, I thought as they were picking on these people, and I got the impression that the guy that was sort of hounding them all as witches was doing it for his own benefit, if you like, to get on in the world. He knew at the time that this was the in thing to do, was to sort of get hold of witches. And so he got hold of these people, but there's no record of why one got let off.
No.
When I looked, sorry to interrupt, I think when I looked it up, that Alice's testimony is the only one that seems to be missing. So I think it's lost to history. So she was acquitted, but the reason why is a mystery.
Was that what you would say, Terri?
Yes, but I think the crux of it is that they proved that she had not murdered the child that she was looking after. And I believe that Fleetwood was the main instigator there. Whoever else was involved to speak up on Alice's behalf. I believe that's true anyway.
Oh, thank you.
All right, thank you.
So we think that Roger was a pretty unpleasant character, but what about Richard, the husband? Because sometimes I liked him, so obviously sometimes I didn't like him. What did you think about Richard, Jess?
It's really hard to say, because obviously he married a child, which, where you're coming from in our modern view of it, that is very, very wrong. And he always refers to her as a child, doesn't he? He talks about like her wild ways, and tells her off when she was pregnant the third time or something, and blames the miscarriage on rolling around with the dog. And at that point, you really do not like him, because yes, he's not a nice person. And I think when you get towards the end, and the when he helps her quit Alice, you're sort of meant to feel that maybe he's redeemed himself. But I don't know if personally I could, because you have to look at the whole bigger picture and the person he is. And you know,
I think for that period in history, men were probably generally more like that and had different assumptions about what they wanted from a wife, or what a woman's role was. But I still also think that, you know, there are the humans involved, and not all couples would behave in the same way regardless of the time in history. But it's an interesting thing to ponder, isn't it? Any other opinions on Richard?
I just think that it's looking at it from, you know, as a modern audience, he's harder to accept. I think you have to read it within the context of the time, like you say. And I guess that the fact that he is flawed makes him a more rounded and believable character. And, you know, sometimes he is despicable, and other times is, you know, he does redeem himself. And I guess that's perhaps a bit more realistic. And I think ultimately Fleetwood settles into a family life with him and is happy. So I think for the time, he's perhaps the best you can expect.
Yeah, I mean, he was the second husband, wasn't he? And the first one that she'd actually been married to when she was 4. And there were some suggestions about she continued to live at home because it wasn't appropriate to send them out as a wife at the age of 4. But there were some suggestions that something had happened to her, and the marriage was annulled. So actually, she probably got a better deal with Richard, which kind of brings us to the subject of the mother, I thought, because she seems to have a very bad relationship with her mother. But I wondered if, to some extent, her mother was slightly misjudged. What do you think, Clare H? Clare Harvey? What did you think to the mother?
I thought, I thought that it was good the way that relationship developed, because at the start, the mother was obviously kind of an antagonist kind of character. You know, her mother was cast in the role of a baddie. She was always tight-lipped and sending her off to do things she didn't want to do, or stopping her from doing things she didn't want to do. And then by the end, you could see that the mother was as much a victim of that patriarchal society as the daughter had been in the between them at the end, where they, Fleetwood realised that her mother had been trying to protect her in childhood, and that was why her mother always slept in her bedroom. It wasn't because she was being overbearing, it was because she was being protective. And she had chosen Richard because actually he was a better deal. He was young, he was good looking, he was kind, he supported her. He behaved in the manner of a man, as you said, at that time, but was probably the best she could get for her daughter. And so I thought that was interesting to show that. And that was part of her own growth. You know, the whole story was coming of age. It was her journey from childhood to womanhood, wasn't it? And it was only as she attained womanhood that she understood things from her own mother's perspective. Only as she had a child of her own that she realised what it was to be a mother and the hard choices you have to make within those relationships. So I thought that relationship was really well drawn for me.
I enjoyed that because, to begin with, I thought she was appalling and thought, how could any mother treat a child like that? But I suppose with hindsight, Fleetwood was a teenage girl, and teenage girls very often don't like their mothers, and everything their mother does is bad. And I did begin to gain some sympathy towards the mother as the story progressed. What about Katie, did you have any opinions on the mother-daughter relationship or anything else?
I think I would have had similar observations. I will say, like, towards the end of the novel, I thought that, you know, she seemed to forget about everything that her mum had done just in an instant, which I found quite unnatural, right? I'll say that if I spend, you know, too much time at home with my own mum, I revert to being the Fleetwood age version of me, right? Yeah. You know, and I thought, okay, that was the bit that didn't sit, you know, as comfortably with me. But I think, yes, as lots of us have mentioned already, the context of the time, where if you had a daughter, that was all that you were preparing them for, marriage and childbearing, that she was at least attempting, as you said, Claire, to be more protective than maybe it was it came through, you know. And I think even modern mothers can sometimes be, you know, the version of, oh well, your dad always had, you know, another woman around, probably now is oh, do you really want to wear that? Somebody is going to think that you look horrible, you know, which in reality, it's who cares what the person down the street thinks of you? You probably care more about what your parent thinks of you. But it, almost that that protective element did come through for me as well, that maybe she was being slightly misunderstood.
And going back to the relationship between Fleetwood and Richard, she certainly had a better deal than Alice had with her partner. I mean, he didn't figure quite so largely in the story, but I found that a bit incongruous, because Alice seemed like such a strong character from the outset, and I couldn't quite understand why she'd got together with this very unpleasant man, or whether he became more unpleasant as they were together. Jess, what did you think about Alice's relationship?
Hard to say, isn't there? Because there wasn't a lot of it in the book, so you have to sort of read between the lines a little bit. I think I'd make some assumptions that perhaps he was a better deal to start with, or perhaps when he was grieving for his wife, he was a different person than what he became later down the line. And then I suppose, yes, when he lost his daughter and then he blamed Alice, then that became part of who he was, and the loss of then a wife and a daughter added to who he became as what we assume is a drunk. So that had an effect.
People were very often very cruel, or they came across as very cruel, and you know, knowing that the ultimate outcome was that someone was going to be hung or even burnt as a witch. You know, even if you fell out with your partner, I think most of us would hope that they wouldn't go that far. They wouldn't want that for us, even if they were feeling very resentful. But yeah, there was a lot of cruelty. Did you find that, Terri?
Yes, and it's for me, it was like the law of the jungle, man eats man, if you like. You know, there's Roger yearning to be affirmed by King James I and all of his peers. There's Richard, who is desperate to fit in with his expected role as, you know, a new husband and so on. But for me, just coming back to the differences or similarities between Alice and Fleetwood, Alice, I believe, in a sense, was the richer. You know, she's this poor, illiterate healer, and yet she had choices in her life. She could decide who she was going to live with. She could decide, you know, many other things, whereas Fleetwood, because of her position in society, was told, you will marry X and you will bear children. So everyone, every character, apart from Alice and Fleetwood, I believe, is almost living up to their perceived expectation.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And what about the familiars themselves? I mean, Puck being a prime example. I didn't really think too much was made of that, but when Alice had bled Fleetwood, which was supposed to be a cure for some ailment of pregnancy, and there was a bowl of blood, no, there was the bowl of blood just disappeared, and I could only assume that the dog had drunk it. There are no sinks to tip that kind of thing down. And I suppose to remove it from the room would have drawn suspicion onto Alice. Did anyone else have any thoughts about the familiars that appeared throughout the book?
I think well, not we, but the women are each other's familiars. So I think Alice was Fleetwood's familiar and Fleetwood was Alice's familiar, because they were supporting each other, and that's why it's familiar. I think because there wasn't a huge.
Very interesting take on it.
The first sees Alice, she sees a fox, doesn't she? She doesn't see herself, sees her as an animal. So I think you could argue that Alice is Fleetwood's familiar and protecting throughout. That's why they're familiars. And ultimately, Fleetwood saves Alice, doesn't she? So in that regard, she is her familiar, and so I think that's the familiars. But I don't know. But that
is an interesting observation. And why do we think that it was usually women that were had up as witches? There were some men, but it was disproportionately women. Clare B,
I think it's because they were normally intelligent women who often hadn't married or had married and things had happened, who were acting as midwives, knew a little bit about medicine, and so people were scared of them. They were normally women who would probably speak out for what they wanted, and men didn't normally like that. And it would be difficult for them. They would be making their living, as you say, midwives, and sort of helping people when they were poorly, and getting recompense for that, and so that was all that was about. I wonder how many people genuinely believed in witchcraft in those days. I'm not sure whether the guy that was actually collecting all the witches together really believed in it. I think he was using it for his own political ends.
I would agree with that. And doing a little bit of background reading, sometimes it was feuds between different families and neighbours, which seemed to be the case there. But I wondered also whether, medicine, even today, it's very magical, trying to understand how it works. So in the context of so long ago, anyone that had the power to cure someone, maybe it did seem a bit voodoo and a bit, there's all that can't quite be right. How on earth can they do that? So maybe there was fear, and it was quite often the women who were the wise women and the healers. So perhaps it was also because of that reason that they were targeted as witches, because they had some kind of power that other people didn't really understand.
It's power. Men in that period wanted a monopoly on power, and this was an area where they didn't have power. But it was a kind of I read somewhere that it was when there was more witchcraft trials where resources were scarce. So it was a sort of Bertie's way of culling women who were no longer of childbearing age and were therefore no longer useful to society. Interesting, but it was kind of useful to think of someone as a witch and get rid of them, because if they weren't supporting children anymore, they were of no use to the community.
Yeah, that's true. What else can I think of? I think I've asked all the questions that I'd thought of. Are there any other observations that people wanted to mention that I've
We haven't mentioned the little girl who was
Janet.
Yeah, and I found that fascinating, how she was being used, and whether she actually really understood what she was doing to these other people, or just, you know, because she was a child and she was just saying, oh yeah, and she did that and that, because it was getting her noticed and getting her things that she wanted. I don't know.
And she was living in the posh house, wasn't she? And presumably being looked after very well and fed fine foods that she wouldn't have had a hope of having. But whether she, as you say, she realised, because I think it was her mother, wasn't it? She, contributed to the hanging of her mother. And whether she realised that that was going to be the ultimate outcome, I don't really know.
Because all they would probably do with her once they'd used her and got all that is they'd probably find some position in some house for her. She'd end up as a servant somewhere.
Yeah, she
would. No better off. She wasn't going to get anything out of it, was she, really? But she didn't understand, I don't think.
No. Well, I did enjoy it. As I said, I read it maybe a couple of years ago. And I knew that I'd liked it. I think I enjoyed it more listening to it. I think I perhaps picked up on more as I was listening, and it certainly made me want to read some more by Stacey Halls. Has anyone read any of her other books?
No.
I've
Katie?
read both of them.
Oh, right. Have you managed to read Mrs. England? Because that's quite new, isn't it?
Yeah, I have. And I think Mrs. England is really interesting because it's the first time where she's tried to she's departed a little bit more from basing something on something real, essentially. So in The Familiars, it starts with a real person who lived at a real place. She moves on in The Foundling to here's a real place and here's an imagined story, like out of it. But where some of the story just comes from the idea of what was happening, like at the Foundling Hospital at the time, through maybe as her confidence has grown, like as an author, to just saying, okay, the atmosphere of like the old mills in Hebden Bridge is where we want to set like Mrs. England. And so even though Mrs. England is based on a lot of the history of the Norland nannies, like, and where that came from and how they still exist today, much more of that is still that same atmospheric style, but that research is kind of in the background, you know, whereas in The Familiars, she's provided some of that story by just the existence of, you know, the real people, and knowing that Fleetwood was very young when she got married, and, you know, all of those things. I think they're all similar, but like really different, like in a lot of ways.
Have you got a favourite of the three?
I think The Foundling is my favourite.
Oh, okay. And what about you, Terri? Have you read any of the others, or would you? Because you had quite mixed feelings about it, didn't you?
Well, I found it a compelling read, but I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I would readily recommend it. But no, I haven't read any of the others yet.
But you think you might?
I may do.
Yeah, Jess, would you?
I read The Foundling. I enjoyed that, but I think I enjoyed The Familiars more. The Familiars made me, because I looked at the house, Gorthorpe Hall is an actual National Trust place, so I'd really like to go and visit and see the place and, you know, like kind of imagine what the story happening there. That would be really interesting. I also looked up who built the house, because I quite like a bit of architecture. So, what's his name, Robert Smithson or something. He's the guy, the architect that is for Woolerton Hall and Hardwick Hall. So there's a local connection there too.
Okay. Clare, Saribi, have you read any of the others?
I have. I've read The Foundling, and just to pick up on what Jess said, what's really interesting is that Katie and I are friends, and we both attended a talk with Stacey Halls. And what was really interesting was how when she starts to write, the thing that jumped out at me was that she has to have like a plan of the house, you know, and like the area mapped out. So she's, you know, she can go into every room and know what it looks like. And I think when you read the books, you really do have a sense of that place and the buildings and the architecture. And I know, for example, when I read The Foundling, which is, you know, based on real places, you know, and some of the artwork that's in the house, I was able to look up, and I just love that, because you could really visualize the place, and then go even further, and surround yourself with actual images of some of these things and the fashions of what they would have been wearing. And I looked up what would happen is when a destitute mother left a child at the Foundling Hospital, often they'd be illiterate, so they would create a token, and they would leave half at the hospital and keep half in the hope of claiming their child back again. And you can go onto the museum's website and you can see these exquisite hand embroidered tokens. And that, as Jess and Katie, you've read the Foundling, will know, there's the token, there's a foundling in the story, and there's a token made of whalebone, which becomes quite significant. So yeah, for me, I really enjoy historical fiction, and just that level of research. I think she said she just uses, just like 10% of what she finds out, but it sort of seeps through, and I think that really grounds you in the place in the book.
Oh, thank you. So I'm not sure if anyone will be aware, but Clare Harvey, who's with us today, is actually a published author. And I wondered if you would agree with that. Do you find that you really immerse yourself in the time period, and does that help you to write it, or does it come from somewhere else with you?
Yeah, I think historical fiction authors just love the research, and you can just go down these rabbit holes where you find yourself researching these odd things which may or may not make it into the story, but just get a bit fascinated with them. So yeah, I think that's probably similar for most.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. So does anyone else have any final observations or comments that they'd like to make before we wrap it up for today? Well, I'm looking forward to going and reading my next Stacey Hall's book. In fact, as soon as we come off this, I think I might book myself one from the library. So thank you very much for joining us all today. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I'll see you all again another time. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Fiona.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.